we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Velocity Software CVM training class. My name is Sam Weigman, and I will be your host this week as we go through parts of Module 4. We have a couple of rules I want to go over. First, all sessions are being recorded. Recordings can be found on our website in the near future. Second, everyone will remain muted. Any questions should be typed in the chat box or emailed to questions@velocitysoftware.com. We have people monitoring the chat to help answer your questions. Third, some of our sessions will involve a built-in WebEx tool called Slido. This is for multiple choice quiz questions. If you cannot use Slido for whatever reason, please put your answers to the quiz questions in the chat. Up first, we have Intro to RACF with James Vincent. James has been working with ZVM systems for over 40 years and has been at Velocity for 9 years. He loves kayaking and sitting on the beach with a good book. Go ahead, James.
Thank you, Sam. Well, welcome everybody. I am going to walk you through RACF administration at a high level. It's going to give you at least some ideas about being able to administer your system with RACF, and hopefully give you some tips on being able to manage it a little bit easier. So let me dive right in. These are some of the topics that I will be going through in this session. The key or the main section of the content will be around the administration and the recommendations around administering RACF, but also the way to think about your security on your system and translating it into RACF to make your RACF system set up the way you need it to be. Now, I put some references on this slide from Alan Altmark and Bruce Hayden. These are two IBMers that have been doing RACF with customers for a long, long time. They've been in the trenches. They know RACF in and out when in perspective of what customers and companies need to use RACF for. So their references are very, very good to have. Now, why do you need an external security manager like RACF? That question should be pretty obvious, especially in this day and age. The first and foremost one would be your company is likely going to insist that everything is secure. There's a lot of people out there that are going to try to break into places that have data that they want. So any financial institution, government institution, and a lot of companies are going to have data that people will want to get their hands on. And your systems need to be rock solid when it comes to security, because the company does not want to be on next week's headline in the newspapers. The other reason is your basic ZVM or CP security really is not good enough. In days gone by, people got through without an external security manager on every system because it was good enough for those times. There wasn't a big concern about people breaking in and getting to things that they shouldn't on those systems. But an ESM provides you so much more over what CP gives you in regards to control and auditing, encrypting your passwords, the multi-factor authentication, which a lot of people are doing now, and also more access control for resources instead of just using plain passwords. So your security is probably going to be driven by some policy from your CIO or CSO or somebody at a high level in your company that want or will dictate exactly what they expect each system to be locked down with. So it's a security policy. Also, system audits determine your compliance. And your goal as a system administrator, if you're working on RACF and the security of your system, is to make your auditors happy. You want to keep your auditors happy because if they're not happy, you will be spending a lot of time in meetings and doing a lot of paperwork and justifying what they're finding. So who implements that security policy? That's usually a security administration group. So it's a group or a department specifically assigned to manage and implement a security policy. Normally, that is independent of a system programmer or system administrator in a lot of cases. In some cases, a system programmer could have full authority over a test system environment. But in most cases, it's going to be a security group that's going to be driving that. Access to the resources on those systems normally is set up through the policy to be by way of a request or justification to access the resources, and then a lot of waiting to get those accesses set up. But there's also a break glass, what we used to call a red letter in the data center for emergencies. If the system is down or it's just crippled and something is terribly wrong at 2 o'clock in the morning, then you need to get access quickly. And we had what was called a red letter that we could open and get credentials to be able to fix things. Speaking of 2 a.m., this was a random thought while I was putting this session together many weeks ago, literally at 2 o'clock in the morning, laying awake thinking about it, that RACF is a little bit like your cell phone. Most people don't really know how to use their phone 100%, that with everything and every feature on the phone. They know how to use it for basic stuff, to answer a phone call, send a text message, that kind of thing. But there is so much more that phones can do these days that most people don't take advantage of. And if you only use part of that phone once or twice a year, it's really, really easy to forget how to use it. And the same is true with RACF. So let's go over some basics of RACF, the fundamental foundation of what makes up RACF. And these are terms and things you'll probably run into quite a bit as you're maintaining RACF on your system. So it is a pre-installed feature of ZVM, but it's also a priced option. It may be already pre-installed and available on your ZVM system, but you do have to have the feature code enabled and paid for in order to use it. There's a maintenance user ID that's used. It's called 7VMRAC, and then the release number of the system. For instance, 40 for ZVM 7.4. That manages and installs all the service and software for the RACF environment. RACF VM, that's the user ID that controls pretty much everything on the ZVM system. All the resources, all the databases, all the SMF records or the audit records. That RACF VM ID is what CP talks to in order to make decisions on security requests. The RAC maint ID is for security services if RACF VM is broken and other things that can be done as far as maintenance and reporting. But if RACF VM is down for any reason, no one except the operator can log on to the system. There are no RACF validations being done at all. RACF SMF, that's a user ID used for running the audit reports and archiving your SMF records. Now, installation and configuration of RACF. It's already installed on your system by default. So you can get the RACF program directory and follow that program directory for your configuration. There are different ways to set up RACF depending on your system and what requirements that you have. Now I point out to read and follow Alan Altmark's titled RACF the Right Way, and also see APAR VM 66892. That is a very important APAR, and if you're freshly installing or configuring RACF, you will want that APAR on. It will make your life much, much easier when you're configuring RACF. I'll get into a little more detail in a few moments. There's also two YouTube uh, entries out there under the IBM's EVM education page, the how to get started with RACF enablement and how to get started with RACF with configuration. They give you a really good overview of things that you should be aware of and that you might want to take note of before you start configuring your RACF environment. Now, some terminology. Terminology within the RACF environment sometimes can be a little tough to grasp, but the more you see it, the more you read it, the better off you're going to be. So a resource, in regards to RACF, a resource is a thing or a place where data resides, such as the mini disk, or that data passes through, like a terminal, or CP functions, commands. There are classes that RACF will batch into for depending on which resource you're talking about. So resources are grouped together into these classes. The ones I highlighted are the most common ones that people will be working with. You may choose to work with the other classes, but the ones that are highlighted are the most common. So VM command for CP commands, VMM disk for mini disks, VMX event are profiles for commands and auditing, and surrogate or log on by for your ID, user IDs. Now on RACF commands, there are some things that you see, some options that you will see that you will want to know about also. The class option is the resource class you're working with. So if you are doing a CP command rule, VM CMD would be the class. The ID option is one or more user IDs that the rule is going to apply to or that will impact. The access, the permission you want to set for that type of access. And then there's a UACC or universal access setting, the default access for anyone that doesn't specifically have a rule for that resource. And default group, and this is for setting up a user, but that's the default group name that you want to set. Now, permissions for access and universal access. There's a few of those that you want to be aware of. Alter allows full control access to mini disks. Control, read write with for mini disks, and it also allows promiscuous mode if you're setting up rules for vSwitches. Update allows read write access with to mini disks. It also is used for send and transfer of spool files if you choose to use that. Read is in my mind a way to look at it to be a yes, to be an allowed access. So read is read only for disks. It allows access to VM commands. It also allows access for surrogates. So it's a yes, no type of way to look at it. And then none, no access. Now, your security policy and RACF setup. The first and foremost, always conform to your security policy. If you diverge away from what your company's security policy is, that's going to just make your life more difficult. So always make sure that you're planning your security configuration to match your policy. Now you want to configure RACF for only the resources that users own and really use. The easiest time to do that is when you set up RACF. If you have to do that later, if you choose to put everything into RACF and configure everything on in RACF, and then come back later and adjust things, turn resources off that RACF shouldn't have to manage, etc., it's much more difficult doing it later than it is when you set up RACF. There is a utility that produces the data that you need to set up RACF using your source user direct, the CP directory input, and that helps you get things set the way you need them. And I call out Alan Altmark's RACF the right way again because he walks through using that RPI direct output to manipulate it so that your system is set up the right way for the things that you absolutely need. Because there are a lot of resources and a lot of classes that RACF will by default enable that you do not need. Now that APAR, I also call out again, will make your life a lot easier, and it's based on what Alan Altmark walks through in his presentation, RACF the Right Way. So it makes your configuration a lot cleaner. It will turn off things by default instead of leaving them turned on. Now let's talk about passwords or passphrases. Traditionally on your ZVM systems, passwords are used. Those are 1 to 8 character strings that you use to log on to your system. But today, these days, they're generally not good enough anymore. So a lot of companies are choosing to use passphrases. And RACF supports passphrases along with passwords. You can actually configure RACF and allow both at the same time. You can log on with a password or log on with a passphrase. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but maybe as a transition, you could do that. So in RACF terms, if you're going to enable passphrases and turn off passwords, you would just use the phrase option instead of password option when you're adding users or updating users to reset their passwords or passphrases. Passphrases have some special rules that you'll need to be aware of, like a default minimum length of the password. There's also an exit that you can implement your own company's security policies when it comes to passwords and passphrases. But all of that is detailed in the Security Server Systems Programmer's Guide in Chapter 6. Another thing about passwords and passphrases is encryption. If you're going to encrypt them in your database, you have to set that up before you create user profiles. If you choose to turn on encryption later, you have to unload your RACF database, enable encryption, and then reload the database. It is more complicated. So again, this is best done before you start adding user profiles. You can also set the minimum age and extra controls for passwords and passphrases. Those are easy to change later, but they're best to set up at the beginning. And for example, in the RPI direct sysut1 file that's produced in that utility, you can set up the set password with the algorithm to use for encryption, and then also set the rules for the passwords or passphrases as far as the minimum number of days, or how many changes can be done per day, how many invalid attempts it takes to revoke access to that user ID, the expiration interval, and how much history is kept to compare against old passwords when they're putting in a new password. Now, as far as setting up for logon by, or what's called surrogate access within RACF, this is one thing that you really want to pay attention to from a system administration aspect. The surrogate access, it improves the security and auditing, and it really does help and or add an ease of use to your ZVM system. I recommend, and so do many others, that you set up generic profiles for use with the surrogate class. So you can start off by thinking of your system administrators, your ZVM system administrators. Usually you're going to have more than one person doing this job. So use a group. You create a group for those people. You set it up so that anyone in that group can use logon by to any user ID in the system that does not already have a discrete logon by profile in the surrogate class. I'll go into that just a bit more. Now, Linux administrators is another group you might want to think about. You might want to build a group for them to be able to log on by their Linux servers that are hosted on the ZVM system. You can set up patterns if you follow a pattern with your hosts, your Linux guests on the ZVM system. And if the patterns don't work, you can also use what's called RACF vars if the target IDs or the user IDs don't follow a specific pattern. So you can group them together. Now you also want to focus on adjusting operator to be accessed by logon by only. In RACF, you'll set its password as LBY only, and then set the no password, no phrase attributes in RACF for operator. That means nobody can use a password or passphrase to log on to operator. And then the generic logon by dot asterisk asterisk is the generic rule. That rule will allow access for the systems administration group to be able to log on to the operator user ID. And I gave you two examples of how to set that up with the RACF commands. Time for a quiz. Now, I did not necessarily go over everything on this quiz, but I'm hoping you get the answers right based on what you already know. So, Sam, you want to go ahead and activate it?
Yep, so Slido should be popping up on your screen right now. If you are able to, go ahead and click that join button. We'll give people a couple seconds to join in, and then I will launch the first question. If you cannot use Slido, feel free to just answer the questions in the chat box.
All right, everybody, you did really well on that. If you were kind of thinking about it, I gave a hint to the first question by asking the second question. So if RACF is down and unaccessible or something's wrong, that it is just not functional, how do you log on to operator? CP will let you log on with its password that's in the CP directory. And what is that password in the CP directory for if RACF is active? It's only there in case RACF is down. So the only purpose for it would be is to use it when RACF is not available. So the RACF or the CP directory password for operator really should be set to something that all of your system administrators are going to know. And it can be fairly obvious. It can be a simple password because RACF, when it's running, doesn't use that password for anything, and neither does CP. It's only for emergencies. All right, very good. Now, RACF, overall, RACF for most people is not intuitively obvious. For those that have spent time with RACF, it becomes more learned. You understand the terminologies better. You understand the commands and the different syntaxes that are used in the different commands that RACF has. But there really should be a connection between what I'll call security thinking and RACF. Because somebody in security will say, this has to happen, and then you or someone will need to translate that to make RACF set to match that security thinking. For instance, if somebody says, we need to deny James access to TCP maint's 592 minidisk, that would translate into that RACF command. It's a permit command with a class and the ID and access set. Now, if somebody says, we need to turn on auditing for diagnose x88. Well, what does that mean? You have to translate that to be able to set RACF up to start auditing on those diagnose 88 events. So if you remember back in the resource definitions, that the thing is the resource that RACF is going to protect. And that thing, when in regards to a mini disk, would be the user ID and the virtual address of the mini disk. And in regards to surrogate or logon by, it's the user ID and the action of logon by. The target is the user ID that the rule applies to, or that will impact when it's set. So try, if you can, try to think of what's needed in plain English, and then break it down for RACF. Now, growing up, I don't know how many of you may remember this, but a lot of us went through sentence diagramming, and I really didn't enjoy this, but I remember going through it. I remember some of this, but I was thinking that's the kind of thing that we need with RACF, is to be able to break apart the request and turn it into what RACF would understand. So the phrase deny James access to TCP maint 592, if you break that down, the deny is the access. That's the access set for the resource. James is the target ID, because that ID, that user ID, is who it's going to impact. The TCP maint 592, that's the resource, which happens to be an MDisk or a mini disk, and that is in the class, the RACF class, VMM disk. So that translates into update the permission for TCP maint.592 in VMM disk for James to none, or the RACF command as listed with the options as presented. Now I put a caveat there. If the base resource profile is not defined, you have to use the rdefine command to create it. And RACF will tell you that if you try to do this permit and there's no resource profile for that disk yet. Now I got to thinking this would maybe be a good place for AI, because maybe AI would help us translate this request of deny James access into RACF. So I gave it a shot. I asked ChatGPT, how would you turn that phrase into a RACF command to run on ZVM? And notoriously, its answer is wrong. So it laid it out with a command that actually will not work in RACF, but it did put in a little bit more information, which I also defined or mentioned before as far as the resource profile not already existing. And I will go into resource profiles here in a moment. So this is just, again, just a diversion, so to speak, using AI. AI, you have to double check what you're doing even in AI. So let's go through some of the classes, the more commonly used classes, and how to manage them within RACF. The VMM disk, or the mini disk control class. This is one of the most commonly used classes within RACF. Now, a good directory manager will automatically interact with RACF. When you're adding and deleting mini disks, it will take care of doing the resource define or the resource delete for the profile of that owner user ID and disk. So the usual steps in setting up a VMM disk access is to do the rack rdefine VMM disk with the resource, who owns it, and then a universal access, the default access for that resource. So that is setting up the resource profile. That rdefine is for a long term. The rdefine is for resource profile definition. Now the owner.vaddr portion of that command, that's the user ID and mdisk address that you're trying to protect. Do not pad the addresses with leading zeros. So any mini-disk address, do not pad with zeros. Even if it's a one number address, you literally just put, if you had a CP directory entry for a mini disk, and let's say it was device 8, the number 8, which is perfectly valid, you would put owner dot the number 8 as the resource. Now the resource owner is set to the issuing user ID if it's not defined on the command. So if let's say maint is setting up this resource profile, maint will become the owner of that security definition if one's not provided. So it identifies who created the profile, but also who owns that profile. And then the universal access of none, that's recommended. It's highly recommended, and it is the default for all security or all directory managers when it's talking to the security system. It will set the universal access as none. But it's good to set universal access as read if you're setting up public disks. If you have a specific disk that you want everybody to be able to have access to, there's really no reason you should have to set up permissions for everybody when you just want them to get to it all the time, anytime. You would just do a universal access read. And then you go through and set up permissions for people to be able to access the resource. And the very first permission is to give the owner of that disk the ability to access it. This seems kind of crazy. Excuse me. It seems weird to have to do this, but that's how RACF is. If you define the profile to be universal access none, RACF literally will not allow anybody to have access to that resource unless they have permission. And that includes the disk owner. So you set the permission for the owner with access alter, which gives them full access to their own disk. Then the next step would be optionally to provide access to other people, to other user IDs, to be able to read or update or whatever the case may be. And if you have to or want to, you can specify more than one user ID in the ID option. So you can just separate them by spaces. Now removing permissions. Let's say somebody shouldn't be accessing that particular mini disk anymore, and you want them to default to the universal access. You would simply do another permit, but in this case, you will delete the ID from the permission. So it removes their specific permission from that profile for the resource. Now you can also query the profile and see who has permissions and what their permissions are using the RAC R list VMM disk, a specific owner and virtual address, a mini disk resource, and then the parameter all. All includes a lot of extra information, but at the bottom of all of it is the list of user IDs and their access that is set for that resource. The next class that I'm going to go through is surrogate or log on by. This is probably the second biggest or commonly used class within RACF on ZVM systems. So for instance, if I want to allow James to use logon by for Rich's user ID, that breaks down into allow, so the access, what kind of access to set for the resource. James is the target ID because that's the user ID that the rule's going to impact. And logon by Rich is the resource. So it's an action thing. It's an action, but in RACF terms, that is a resource. So that would translate into update the permission for logon by .rich in surrogate for James to read. Because in this case, the permission is going to be yes or no. Yes being read, no being none. That turns into the RACF command to do the permit with the logon by.rich, which is the resource, with the surrogate class, James as the ID, access read, or basically yes, be that James is allowed. Just like with mini disks, if the resource profile is not defined, you're going to use RDefine to create that RACF resource, which I'll go into here in this slide. Now, I'm going to call this out again because it is very important to set up generic groups for profiles, especially to use with the surrogate profile. It just makes system administration a lot easier. So any user ID with a surrogate profile defined is excluded from the generic group. Now, what that means is if you have real people defined on your system, which you probably will, those real people user IDs should always have a surrogate profile defined. And that just simply sets them up to, it locks out the generic profile access from being able to log on by their user ID. So it protects real people user IDs from being able to be logged on by default. Now, do you want, again, this falls into how RACF treats its security. If you define a profile for logon by for a user ID, RACF by default says, great, that means anyone accessing this user ID needs to use logon by, including that user ID. So you want to enable that user ID to be able to access their own user ID by logging on. So you provide access to them to be able to use the logon to their ID. If you do not define a surrogate profile for a user ID, then by default, any generic profile that was set up, the logon by dot asterisk asterisk generic resource, has access to be able to log on by the user ID. So Linux guests or any system user IDs, those things that are not real people would not have a specific surrogate profile set up. That would allow your system administrators to be able to log on by to those user IDs. All right, now keeping RACF healthy, keeping things nice and cleaned up. Unfortunately, RACF doesn't do that by itself. In most cases, it doesn't clean up. It doesn't clean up things. And finding all of those things that are littered throughout a RACF database is not that easy. So this is just one very simple example of a user ID with some RACF rules set up for different kinds of resources. And if you can see here in this list, it's just listing out what RACF rules are set up, what profiles are set up that are based on this user ID or that affect this particular user ID. It's a user in RACF. It has two groups that are defined that it can use. It has a mini-disk profile set up. It has a vSwitch profile set up. It has logon by rules set for it. Now, if your system does not have a directory manager, you're doing all of the CP directory work manually. And if you remove the directory entry for this example or examp user ID, well, all the RACF rules are still there. They're still in the database and they're still active because there is no CP interaction with the directory or with RACF when you change the directory manually. Now, what that means to you is if you create, let's say you create this user ID EXAMP on your system, and you forget to change or update RACF later, or when you delete the user ID and you're done with it, and then someone else comes along and creates a user ID with the same name, the same EXAMP user ID. That new user ID just inherited all of the RACF rules. So it has access to anything that was defined prior. This is one big reason why companies do not reuse user IDs. There are because a lot of security and a lot of access settings that have been done, they don't necessarily have a complete and full handle on all of those authorizations. They prefer to just not reuse any user ID ever. So they will constantly create brand new user IDs. Now, let's say you remember to delete that RACF user. So you run the RACF command, del user, and then the user ID. One would think that RACF would go through and clean everything up. But unfortunately, we would be wrong. All of those things that you see listed in the graphic below are still left over in the database. Now, this is just one very, very simple example. If your RACF database has been around for a while, you probably have a lot of entries in the database that are just trash. They're not used, but they're just cluttering up that database. Now, if you do have a directory manager, for example, there's one that we have in one of our products, but it's called ZDirect, that will interact with RACF. So if you delete a user through ZDirect, RACF is completely clean. No, there's no hanging rules or leftover rules within the database. If you have dirmate, dirmate also has a RACF connector that you define. It's defined by default if you have RACF on your system, but dirmate will work with RACF and clean up pretty well. It doesn't do everything. So in this particular case, there was a rule for a VM LAN or vSwitch that is left in the database. One of our products called ZPro also has a connector with, or it will use dirmate as a directory manager. And in this case, ZPro will go through and clean up the rest. So it depends on how your system is set up, what you have available to you, but just be aware that things could be left over in the RACF database if you're not paying attention to it. Now, if you choose to go through and try to find all of those rules in your RACF database that are lingering for no good reason, it's not real easy to do. One way is to unload the RACF database using its utility that's provided and documented. And you can post-process that output. The output is very complicated. There's a lot of codes and things that you'll have to use the manual to figure out what each code means on each record. And then you will need to build some logic. You'll need to build a program to go through and find all the entries that don't align to a user ID that still exists on your system. The other way is to scan the database manually using RACF's various search and RList commands to be able to get all the details that you would need. Again, it's going to require some coding. You're going to have to wrap some code around running the RAC search command and the RAC RList command for all the resources that you want to look for. You're going to be doing some comparisons of user IDs that are found in all of that data compared to the user IDs and groups that you may still have on your system. And then anything that falls out is worth reviewing to figure out if you still need those rules or not. The third option is, again, the product ZPro, which I'm not going to go into, but it will do all of that for you with basically a couple pushes of a button, and you're done. Now, auditors. I mentioned auditors before. You want to keep them very, very happy. The auditors want reports and historical data, and they want them when they ask for them. So you're going to want to be able to provide them the reports and historical data when they need them. It's usually when something weird happens. So the auditors may come to you and say, this situation occurred, show me everything that happened either during this time or for this resource or by this particular user. So you need to be able to provide that information on demand. To do that, RACF SMF, that's your user ID that maintains the audit disks, and it also is used to build the reports. There's an entire manual on this process, the RACF Security Server Auditor's Guide. So that's a great reference to go to when you want to figure out all the details on maintaining and running all of the SMF reports. Now, for active systems, if you've got a very active system, you've got a lot of mini disks, you have a lot of security things going on, you want to pay attention to your audit disks. By default, those disks are built with a size that are generally pretty good for relatively moderate systems. If the audit disk fills, RACF will automatically start up RACF SMF to switch and clear the audit disks. So there is an active disk and a backup disk. And that if one fills, RACF will try or attempt to switch the audit disks so that it can continue to audit the activity in the RACF user ID. So you can consider while you're setting up RACF to increase the 301 and 302 SMF disks. Just make them a little bit larger if you know you're going to be building RACF for a large or highly active ZVM system. You also might want to consider running RACF SMF more than just once a week. You may want to do it daily to make sure you've got good, fresh SMF reporting every single day. Now, these are some tips. For RACF SMF, you might want to consider reporting on everything, and that includes all violations and all successes. Because your auditor, again, might come to you and say, I want to see everything James did last week. And you need to be able to provide them that data. You also should consider moving all of the SMF reports off platform. Take them off the ZVM system. Put them somewhere safe and sound and retain those reports for up to a year. Again, your security policy is going to drive how long to retain things and quite probably where to store those reports also. I would also give you a tip to consider running snapshots of at least your VMM disk and surrogate definitions, because that will help you to recover specific rules in case something gets goofed up. Someone might enter the wrong command at the wrong time and not even realize it, or run an exec that they didn't understand, and it could change or even delete some of those definitions. And then you have to go back and figure out what was set before they did that. If you have snapshots of those rules, you've already got the details you need to reset them really quickly. Now let's consider RACF from a user perspective, just a general user, not a system administrator. They don't have any RACF authority other than being able to use their own user ID. What they can do with RACF is very limited. They can change their own password and passphrase, or their interval, their password interval. They can actually set their password expiration interval to be less than the defined interval number of days. They can look at what RACF has defined for their user ID. They can just do a list user command in RACF, and it will show them exactly how they are set up. They can change their RACF group, their default RACF group, if they choose to. If they have more than one group assigned, a RACF group assigned, they can run the alt user command and change their default group if they choose to. They can also view and change their own mini disk authorizations if they own that resource. If you refer back to setting up the VMM disk profile for a resource, a user ID disk, there is an owner assigned. If that owner does not match the mini disk user ID, then that user ID does not technically own that RACF profile. So in that case, the user ID can't even list the authorizations, and they cannot change anything on the authorizations for their disk. So this is just pointing out, if you create resource profiles for user IDs, especially real people user IDs, you want to make sure that they own their resource profiles, or else they're not going to be able to do anything with them in RACF. So these are just some examples of commands that an end user, a general user, can do against their disk. So they can look at their disk, they can alter it, they can change the default access, and they can add people to be able to access that disk in different ways, or remove them from accessing their disk. Now, summary, again, your security group is likely really driving everything. Your company's CSO or the security administration of your company are going to have policies in place on what exactly you need to be doing on your system and what needs to be secure. RACF may not be intuitively obvious, but if you just take some time, read it, read the documentation, and practice with it, it becomes easier as you keep working with it. And thinking about it, thinking through, again, thinking from the standpoint of how most people will say what they want to do, and to be able to translate that into RACF terminology, the more and more you do that, the easier it becomes. I stress this over and over. RACF, getting that set properly at the beginning, when you first configure your system, is the best way to start. Having to change things after RACF has been running is difficult, and it is very complicated. Keeping your database cleaned up is also important, because if the database is kept clean, then resource requests through CP to the RACF ID are actually a little bit faster if the database is kept clean and tidy. SMF reporting, definitely make sure that's set up, that you run them and retain them, all the reports, again, aligning to your security policy, but just make sure that you have that data available for the amount of time that is required by them, so that you can do reporting and determine what possibly had gone wrong, or answer questions later on. Now, after all of this, and after reading all the manuals and all the resources that are provided to you, it may not still be clear. And that's when you might want to turn to the IBM VM listserv. That listserv has a lot of people on there to answer questions around a lot of different topics, but RACF especially, or in particular. There are people that have been doing RACF for a long time in the listserv, and that will answer even the most basic questions, all the way up to the most difficult questions. So if you're stuck, use your resources that you have available to you, and one of them being the IBM VM listserv. All right, you have a little bit of homework to do for this session. Your task: you were given a user ID for this class that you have access to on our system. If you cannot access our system for whatever reason, if your company has a firewall or whatever the case may be, if you have your own ZVM user ID, and RACF installed on your system, then do the following. You're going to do a RACF command LU or list user to show your user ID settings. You will then do a rlist command to show your 191 disk profile. And of course, you're going to want to replace that user ID with whatever your user ID specifically is. And then capture those results, email them to homework@velocitysoftware.com, and that's it. Your homework is done. Homework is all the homework is checked, and it goes towards your completion certificate for this class. So if you finish your homework, you get your certificate at the end. Any questions or anything that you need help with, you can send to questions@velocitysoftware.com, and that includes RACF. If you're working on RACF, you're stuck on RACF, or you're just maybe just a little bit, it doesn't make sense, send us a question. We'll help you. We'll do the best we can. For more information on any more training and anything that we're offering in the training, ZVM training series, that's on velocitysoftware.com/educate. And all of these presentations for this class are up on velocitysoftware.com/PDFs. So if you don't already have the PDF, you can find it there. I am complete with this session content, so if there are any questions, I will open for them now. I'll ask the moderators, were there any questions presented?
I think you answered all the questions for your content.
Very good. Well, thank you everybody for attending the session. I look forward to seeing your homework assignments, and best of luck.
All right, thank you, James. That was great. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break, so I will set a timer and we will be back here in 10 minutes.